The well-architected framework is really a good tool for looking at one workload at a time, right? A workload is a set of components that make up an application. If a company has 15 workloads, they're doing 15 well-architected reviews. Well, that's great at the workload level, but what is it at the organization level that gives the whole organizational kind of governance and best practices across all 15 of those workloads?
Hello, world. I am your host, William, and I'm here to bring that main character energy, no cap. And with me is my co-host, Yvonne Sharp, one of the greatest minds in deductive reasoning and literally slaying that cheesecake game daily. She's so based, it's actually unhinged. How are you doing today, Yvonne?
I have no idea what you just said. You're trying to be the cool kid on the block, and you need a new crowd because it's over my head, man.
So for the audience, my son plays a travel sport. So I'm in this locker room with all these 8, 9, and 10-year-olds, and they talk in a different language, and I'm trying very hard to learn some of that language. But it's honestly like learning a complete new language. It's pretty wild.
When we were children, all you had to say was something was bad, which actually back then meant it was good, and our elders gave us the eye roll. And I feel like that challenge has increased, or that dynamic is just growing exponentially. Like they're not even words now. So
Agreed. Yeah. Joining us today is Ryan Comingdeer, CEO at Platformr. So first of all, thanks for joining us today, Ryan. And how are things going? Do you have all the Christmas shopping done?
I do have all the Christmas shopping done this year. We jumped ahead a little bit before Thanksgiving to take care of a lot of those this year.
Talk about prepared. I love it.
that's an
That's
accomplishment.
awesome.
We actually have opened Christmas gifts a little bit already, so my kids can, while they're out of school, spend the whole spring break, the whole Christmas break, playing with their toys.
Awesome.
I wish my parents would have done that with me growing up. Thank you again for joining us. I think we were both had the opportunity to be at reInvent this last year, and just kind of looking through a lot of your experience has been in cloud, or at least your more recent experience. But let's go back maybe a little bit further first. Do you want to give us just kind of a quick overview of your background? Like, was it always grounded in software, or how did you get to where you are today?
Sure. Long story short, I took my first programming class in 7th grade. Loved it ever since. So I was in app development and programming from the mid to late 90s all the way until today. Did a lot of consulting, a lot of application building, mobile apps, web apps, enterprise like B2B apps as well. But yeah, I got introduced to the cloud in I think 2008. At that time, I had a data center where I hosted all of my websites that I built. And that data center went down while I was on vacation, and I had to drive all the way back into town. I was like a 6-hour drive in the middle of the night to work on my servers. And I think shortly after that, I said, where can I put these that are not in my closet anymore? So I think 2008 is when I started looking at AWS at that time. So I was moving all my servers up to EC2s. And then after that, it was kind of a history from AWS's perspective. I joined AWS on every one of the services they started working on for the last 15 years and have never really looked back.
It's got to be a better way moment when we were hosting infrastructure, right? I years ago, I worked for an engineering firm, and we the cooling apparatus that was in our data center would frequently go out, and there were no windows. There was no, and I remember in the middle of the ice storm, the power went out, driving to the office and trying to like skate up the frozen driveway to get in the building, to open the door, to set up, to try and cool it with no power in the building other than the generator power that was running the systems, but not the coolant. And yeah, we've all been like, there's got to be a better way.
Yeah, not having to worry about that infrastructure is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is for those of us that love the software side of things, dealing with the hardware and the infrastructure was that necessary evil that we were happy to get rid of. So, absolutely.
Yeah, even with if you think about just things in the past that were so hard, like if you have like multiple data centers, you have to make sure your application is highly available. The bigger the company means you probably have some DR to look after as well. And having to build out your high availability in DR across multiple, data centers for a highly distributed application versus doing it in cloud, it is much different and much easier.
Yeah, I think, as they say, the undifferentiated heavy lifting that every company has used to do by doing disaster recovery environments, by doing infrastructure management, is now mostly removed at some level. And as far as the full-time jobs that require that specialty knowledge, now you've transitioned to more of that cloud specialty knowledge, and hopefully have that opportunity to scale more.
Yeah. So let's talk. I mean, one of the things you have experience with is the AWS Well-Architected Framework, or at least what I could see from some of the work that you've done. If you had to, I guess, if you had to explain what this framework is to maybe someone in a coffee shop that doesn't know tech as well as you do, how would you explain it?
I would probably start with why I even looked at the well-architected framework, and why I started there. So as I had built up my companies over the last 15 years, I was helping a lot. I was a consultant, and I was helping a lot of customers over and over and over again, most of them in that startup to small to medium size. And they were asking for a software development company to come in and help them out. But what they really needed was a CTO to kind of tell them how to manage their technology, how to look at everything from security of the software to reliability of the software to the cost, to make sure that the cost of the goods sold is matching what the revenue model looks like for their customers. So, with more and more of those customers started leaning on us to give them more than just technology, what they said, technology, software development guidance, but really kind of business guidance. And so I kind of built my own little internal framework back in like 2012, just for like a checklist of things that I need to talk to the customers about. But then when Amazon came out with that well-architected framework, that replaced mine. And it was by far the most holistic kind of business checklist of how you should look at technology, how to manage, as far as like best practices, things, question you should ask yourself, whether you are outsourcing your IT team, whether you have an in-house IT team, whether your technology is in the cloud or whether your technology is on-prem. It asks you all the right questions to at least think through what matters to the business. And so I started working, I think, as a beta partner for the well-architected team in like 2016. And then when it launched, I think me personally did more well-architected reviews than any other solutions architect over like a 4-year period. So I really enjoyed it. As I told my job title at the time was a CTO. And as I told other CTOs, like, if you want to be a good CTO, you've got to memorize the well-architected framework. It gives you like this framework, um, this lane to stay in to say, this is what good looks like. And it helps you kind of communicate that to the other, cost departments, security departments, operations, that product owners for usability and performance. So it helps you translate from just writing the code and getting the job done to actually what matters to business. So it was kind of my CTO Bible, I guess you could say, for a long time. I sold my company in 2020. And then after I sold my company, I went and joined that well-architected team. So I became a pillar lead for that well-architected team, just because I loved it so much. And I wanted to kind of keep seeing it mature and grow and get to more of the customers, get to more of the, the lessons learned. I was like, okay, well, what didn't the well-architected framework cover? What pain points was a surprise to the customer because they went through this and we had a gap. And so I wanted to kind of start filling in some more of those gaps on the well-architected framework. And I really enjoyed working on those best practices and understanding how it impacts customers.
That's awesome. I love how, they have, so for those of you that don't know, like there's six pillars, which pillar did you work with specifically?
I was in charge of the performance pillar, which by far is the most technical pillar. And it was probably because of my application development background.
Yeah. I know that like so like I had the opportunity to go through and do some things with this framework as well, like within a real company. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, just because you have this well-architected framework. It doesn't mean that it makes the work any easier, or that, if you don't understand your applications, that there's some like easy button. You still, there's a lot of work to do. And a lot of times what tends to happen is you end up bringing in some professional services or something like that to assist in this journey, because there's going to be a lot of times there's things that a big company is ready for, but then there's a lot of things that company may not be ready for. So I guess, where am I going with this? So do you have any is there any misconceptions that you've seen over the years that are maybe common with companies as far as like adopting this framework? Like, oh, we think we understand this, but then you start, the wheels start turning and you start doing things and it's like, oh, wait, we didn't understand this as well as we thought.
As you said, it has 6 pillars. And to repeat what those pillars are, you have operations, which is always a good place to start because it really is an underlying pillar across all those other 5 pillars. You've got security, you've got costs, you have performance, you have sustainability, and you have reliability. And what I've seen as far as misunderstanding or even misusing that well-architected framework is the well-architected framework team at AWS, at Azure, at GCP, they tried to make it an objective best practices and recommendations. And what I have found after doing hundreds of these well-architected reviews is that the 2 biggest outcomes of going through that is, 1, education of what best practices look like, but number 2 is prioritizing your risks that are contextual to your business. And that is, I think, the biggest struggle that companies have, and that AWS has, trying to use a well-architected framework for customers, is trying to make it objective across all companies with the same level of risk based on the same best practices. And I found that that's not the case. A startup has a different level of acceptance of a risk, such as disaster recovery, than an enterprise company does. And so even though the well-architected framework might say, you because you don't have a good DR plan in place, that might be a high risk for you. Well, that's not necessarily true at a startup company when they are trying to do time to market, when they're trying to prove out a market pain point, whereas opposed to the enterprise company where every minute downtime is an extra $10,000 an hour, right? Or whatever that ends up being with the cost level. So that was probably the biggest friction that the well-architected framework has, is that it is not subjective to based on your company profile. One of the initiatives that I tried to start when I was on the well-architected team was creating a business profile that would show or hide different best practices based on where we thought you were coming from. So a startup company that is going digital native from day one is a completely different list of best practices and risks than an enterprise company that had a lift and shift migration 2 years ago and is running a $1 million annual AWS spend. So that was probably the biggest friction that I've seen customers experience with that well-architected framework. And I think, and I hope that the well-architected team is, and if they're listening today, I hope they are taking some of that and trying to figure out how to adapt it to companies.
So as you look at those frameworks, and I think, I've worked with customers. I was a customer and I've worked with customers for a long time. They often want a prescriptive answer. And how do you guide customers when, you've got a framework, but the framework isn't a turn by turn map for how to get where you want to go. It's a framework. It's like, well, if you're in Kentucky and you're driving to Oregon, people need to go, north and west, but it's not a turn by turn guide. How do you help fill in those blanks for customers who, really what they really want is the turn.
Yeah. So that's a great question and a topic. And I believe all the cloud providers are going to head this direction. So out of the well-architected framework, about 60% of the best practices, you can be fairly prescriptive on the recommendation. And because you can be prescriptive on the recommendation, that leads to the question of then why can't that be an automated recommendation? And why can't we have that built into our cloud consoles to say, now go fix it? If you can automatically identify this as a problem and you're recommending it to me, why can't you just automatically fix it for me? And there are a lot of third-party companies out there trying to do that. There's also AWS. Specifically, I think the Trusted Advisor team was starting to work with the Well-Architected Framework team saying, if you're recommending that all of our servers have an encrypted EBS volume, then when we find one, we'll make an easy button for the customer to say, this is your prescriptive remediation for that. However, that's only 60% because the other 40%, you know, is the reality that every company has a snowflake solution out there with different tech stacks, different business priorities, different recovery time objectives, different security compliances, and it's really hard to create a one size fit all that is inexpensive and appropriate for every company out there. So there's always going to be some need for either professional services companies or for education for the developers to come in and do it from the ground up.
Yeah. So earlier you were talking about being on the performance pillar, which is great. Many or a lot of conversations, I think these days, at least that I'm in, tend to revolve around cost optimization. But sometimes it feels like it's competing with performance, and there's just a lot of confusion there. Is there some like balance or sweet spot to be found, between cost and performance?
Absolutely. And I think that depends on your business goals, right? So if you have a website that is loading after doing a page load after 10 seconds, you have to look at that opportunity loss that you are experiencing with those customers, right? That they just can't sit around and wait. And look at what that could be if you sped that website up to less than a second type of page load. Would that increase usability? Would that include increase your expansion of your product? Would that include more customers coming on board? You always have to look at those third-party numbers on what makes sense for your company and for your technology product there. Uh, but yeah, a lot of times on the performance, you can get bigger servers, faster servers, faster IOPS, and that does result in an instantly higher cost. But if you can now offset that with more on-demand, not reserved kind of compute for all the times that you might need to be running that server. So it's more scaling as your customers scale. There's always kind of those offsets you can run there. But that was a constant conversation while I was having is me and the cost pillar, his name was Ben at the time, sitting down side by side and saying, how can we get both faster and cheaper at the same time? And a lot of times then you always have the underlying requirement of, and we have to meet the security requirement, no matter how fast and how cheap we go. And that was, it's always that natural friction, which is why it's not one size fits all as a remediation.
Well, and there's the we need the fastest performance we can get side of the coin. The other need comes from the enterprise world, which is really where William and I cut our teeth. There's this, we're going to deploy the biggest, fastest thing there just in case, right? And so there isn't muscle memory, and there aren't skills built around determining what exactly I need. Like, what does this application require? And how do I determine that so that I'm not over deploying, right? Because I see so many customers who end up upside down in a cost scenario because they didn't really interrogate what kind of performance their application needed. And they just over deployed because they felt like they could, and because they have that old muscle memory around just give me the fastest, because they've already bought it all anyway, right? They're not used to, paying by the slice as an example. They're like, just give me a whole pizza. So how do you handle that side of it?
Well, the cloud providers, so AWS specifically, they are introducing more and more services and tools that will help you identify that quickly. In the past 10 years, there's been a lot of companies that have been filling that hole of showing you your unused CPU or disk space or IOPS and network usage. But AWS now has a cost optimization dashboard that really highlights for you, say, here's your unused resources and your opportunity to shrink those down. So those are the easy, low hanging identification and recommendations that you could automate that prescriptive solution for the customers on. There's always those exceptions. We, especially in the enterprise world, if there's a lot of big Java applications out there, the Java Virtual Memory Manager is always uh, the gotcha when you're trying to reserve those big EC2s, those big servers where you need memory more than you need CPU. And so right off the bat, those enterprises were like, well, I'm not going to look at the memory optimized instance classes. I'm going to just look at the general ones. And because that one has got 32 gigs of memory, that's what I'm going to use. And then they end up having 90% of unused CPU. So you end up getting more specialized later down the road into more of that memory optimized because of the Java Memory Manager. But yeah, AWS is trying to help those customers. That's one thing I actually really loved about AWS is they are so customer obsessed. They are willing to figure out how to save the customer money, even though it's going to get them less revenue in the door, because they believe that customer is going to stick around and use that budget elsewhere on innovation and growth.
Great answer there. Which I guess I wanted to sort of split this up. So I did want to talk about the well-architected framework, and we've talked about a lot of good things. But what I really wanted to talk to you about, honestly, was, you in 2023, you co-founded Platformr with Bill Stock. So first of all, was there any particular inspiration behind going off and starting this company?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've actually helped me kind of talk a little bit about it already. So the well-architected framework is really a good tool for looking at one workload at a time, right? A workload is a set of components that make up an application. And so if a company has 15 workloads, they're doing 15 well-architected reviews. Well, that's great at the workload level, but what is it at the organization level that gives the whole organizational kind of governance and best practices across all 15 of those workloads? And that's really why we started Platformr. We saw that companies now had some guidance from the well-architected framework team on how to make one software run really well and meets best practices. They introduced the Cloud Center of Excellence idea and team for a governing group of people at a enterprise company or at a mid-sized company to define what cloud best practices look like. But there's no tools. There's no, the industry is just now maturing to the point where now we can start looking at the bigger company management, company governance across all of their cloud usage. And that's why we actually started Platformr is some of the services that AWS has released over the last 4 years have just now started making it possible to start automating more of the organizational governance where it hasn't been existing in the past. And so we saw that companies coming on board AWS were still the only option they had were professional services, were consultants that gave companies kind of snowflake solutions and their own unique spin on based on their experiences on how to set up company governance to then look at all 15 of your workloads, making sure they have the same governance for operations, for security, for cost, for liability to meet those business requirements. So that is the fundamental reason why we built Platformr. It was to elevate it from a workload level up to the company level and say, let's look at this holistically.
And I'm guessing by the name Platformr, it is a platform. So as kind of like an as a service platform that you would plug your stuff into and begin working on. Is that a correct assumption?
It is a good assumption. It is a platform for cloud ops or for cloud governance. Our philosophy here is, Bill Stock, my co-founder, he was a AWS pro serve for about 6 years. I ran consulting company for about 15 years. We are taking all of our prescriptive guidance on how to build cloud governance, as well as how to manage workloads within AWS and making that into a product and a platform. The number one thing that customers want is just a prescriptive answer. As you said earlier, it's like, okay, I have a WordPress website. Well, how do I host a WordPress website on AWS? If you go look at AWS documentation, they'll say, here's 30 different ways to do it. But we know as a consultant, there's really only one or two ways to do it right that meet most of those business requirements out there. Sorry, I picked up WordPress. It's probably one of the least boring or the most boring topics of hosting technology on a website. But But that's an example of saying, let us be a very prescriptive, push button, go configure AWS for you based on your workload type, based on your business requirements.
That's great, and you're absolutely right. Like building on AWS is like building a house. Like you can go to Home Depot and say, "Hey, I need to build a house." They're gonna
Yeah.
say, like, "There's the nails, there's the concrete, there's all your stuff. Have fun.
Yeah.
Gonna be a blast." But there's got to be some middle ground to where you do have, sort of these platforms that bring a lot of things together for you, and they still allow you to have the flexibility of what you want your outcome to be and, sort of tie back into your organizational structure, your organizational policies, compliance, and all these things. So you still get the flexibility to choose how something is done, but a lot of the tedious, all this work under that layer is kind of abstracted to you, which
Yeah.
is great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Amazon uses the analogy of Lego blocks, right? So Amazon's got more than 220 different services. So 220 different types of Lego blocks that they give the customers. And they kind of just say, here, have fun. And you can create a mess out of those Lego blocks if you really wanted to. Where we are trying to say, no, we know how to build this Lego dinosaur really well. Let's build it for you. We're going to ask you a few colors, like a few questions like, what color do you want? You know, some basic things that any company would be able to dictate to a consulting company. And then 90% of the times we just going to build everything else out behind the scenes and take care of that for the customer. Um, yeah, and that's where we're really excited to head out. We're taking that. So I see this cloud governance space as kind of three different areas. You have your organizational governance, which is like your security compliance across the board, your operations across the board. So your standard operating procedures for each workload type, usually each department needs to follow. And then your cost, your budgets, your CFO that's saying, here's all of my budgets across all my workload types. So you have your organizational governance, and then you have your development team or your IT team's governance. And the term platform engineering has come out in the last few years. That's kind of been built off of the DevOps role, and we're taking a lot of that too, and say now we have the company governance. We're moving into platform engineering, so we can help out your development teams and your product ownership teams. And then the final thing we want to do is now help your support team and understand the health of both your company and your workload types. Because in the end, that support team, your internal security team, your IT team, your SREs, they need to understand how to define health between not only the company but also each workload type that you're managing.
One of the I love the Lego analogy, by the way. One of the things I've said, and I believe a lot of this is a maturity curve with public cloud. Like it's just we are just now getting enough infrastructure in the public cloud, getting large enough organizations in there where we realize, wait, we need governance. It it used to be for me the things like governance, program management, all of that were dirty words. But at the end of the day, you got to have some structure for how things get done. But the analogy that I've used often is that customers want a Millennium Falcon, right? They want the Lego Millennium Falcon and they want that to sit on their shelf and look at. And often what they get handed is a bag of gray Lego blocks without instructions. And frameworks, governance, best practices are the difference between that bag of gray Lego blocks and a constructed thing that actually delivers what you want it to.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So, in my own words, William, I think Platformer is the evolution of where well-architected framework will go. I think well-architected framework is at a workload type, and I think AWS has released what's called their Cloud Foundations best practices, which is really that governance at the top level, and that's where we are trying to start with, and get ahead of the customers to say there's easy answers to this. Go find your Lego masters, your master builders. Is that what it's called? Your master builders. And let us build out those Lego solutions for you ahead of time. And you just press the go button. So yeah, we're excited about that.
I have an interesting thought. Well, not interesting. I think it's kind of a dismal thought, really. But uh, a lot of times, many companies, before they will go out and they will buy a platform to do a thing, they have to try it on their own. They have to go and build and like learn a few things the hard way because a lot of times, depending on what Like say you work on the infrastructure side of things. For instance, you think you can build the best infrastructure. You don't want help. You don't want to buy another platform. But a lot of the times you don't realize it, but you really need it. And so what that means is you basically have some technical debt that you have to tidy up, and that technical debt can ride for years. Um, am I is that has that been kind of your experience? And is there an easy way to change? I guess that's perspective in a sense, but is there an easy way to change perspective there?
Well, there's always a conversation to build versus buy, right? And to the decisions that come into play when you're discussing that is time to market, is the amount of technical debt you're willing to get on board, the expertise that you have in house that's available for this. Those are always the type of questions that you're going to bring up when you do build versus buy. Um, at least my philosophy, at least my philosophy with Platformr specifically, is that we are not giving you technical debt from an outside vendor's perspective. Our only outcome is 100% configured AWS services, and let AWS manage the technical debt for you with their feature upgrades, with their service improvements. And then a lot of that then requires education on making sure your team is up to speed on how to use those services. Um, Going right out and gate and buying that, I've always told customers that a technology solution has about a 3 to 5 year life cycle now, between something dramatically changing coming out that's making it irrelevant. So only invest as much as you can when you can get that return on investment over a 5 year period of time. Otherwise, you're going to have to move to another platform, another solution, another tool, whatever that ends up being. You need to be able to reevaluate it. Those customers that have been on the same platform, the same tool for 10, 15 years, they're not doing themselves any benefits there, because you end up not taking advantage of the latest, innovation, technology, so forth. Especially looking right now, like Gen AI is everywhere, and if there's a tool that doesn't have Gen AI on it, you start reevaluating pretty quick. So
This is true. Yeah, AI is in every coming, freshly minted William from reInvent. Um, AI everywhere. Actually, every event that I think I've been to, every event that I've probably been to this year, there's been some sort of theme or rebrand towards AI.
yeah, when we were looking at raising funds for Platformr, every single one of our investor pitches, the questions was, how do you use the AI? Where is it in your title? Where is it in your documentation? It was obviously the answer they were all looking for. So
Oh, I was on mute there. Sorry about that. I'll have to rephrase. I have to look for that line and then come back to it. Um, So one question I have as well. So a lot of the, just kind of looking at what Platformer is doing, you have a focus with AWS, and there's an outcropping of tools and platforms, and some are geared towards single cloud, some are geared towards, taking on other clouds as well. So do you have a multi-cloud future, or do you want to stay zoned in specifically with providing value to the AWS ecosystem?
So have you been talking to my investors? Is that why you bring up that question? um,
So to kind of back that up, I actually work for a company, a network platform
okay.
that builds infrastructure, and we do so for kind of like what you all would do with your area of expertise. We do for networking, and we do it across multiple clouds now. So I usually lead with that question, but uh,
So right now, my team's expertise is in AWS. My support system is in AWS, whether it's partners and customers, whether it's the AWS leadership. So we have more momentum within the AWS world right now. I think obviously their Cham Sam Som, if I just looked at AWS, is quite large on the number of customers that I could onboard into Platformer. I also will get more funding opportunities from AWS if I say I'm AWS only. So there's a lot of reasons why today I am saying I'm a single cloud solution. Now that what I'm hoping for is, as expansion comes, as I get a critical mass of customers in AWS, and I end up being the go-to answer for greenfield customers going to AWS, whether it's migrations or digital native, or for those modernization clients that are looking to fix their cloud governance, then it will start looking into Azure and maybe even GCP. but that'll be down the road. That'll be when I don't need AWS funding to help me scale. Because once I say I'm multi-cloud, I lose a lot of the individual funding per cloud. So yes, it's coming in the future, but only time will tell when that is. Yeah, and I'll have to hire some leadership that are more familiar with the other clouds. I was an Azure partner back in the day, but then I quickly switched to AWS, I think in 2012, and then never looked back after that.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I think I remember I was naive at one point when I was working for a company that um, was one cloud, and I learned that cloud fairly well. It was AWS, and then we went multi cloud, and this the multi cloud decision wasn't my decision, of course, but I was overconfident. I think at the time, and how and our ability to actually set up the governance, the whole scaffolding of that second cloud. You just don't know until you go and you try to do it. You think things are going to be similar, and they are not similar at all. Well, I mean, some things are kind of close, but a lot of things are very different. Like even like we've had a lot of conversations as of late about the Kubernetes platforms between clouds, and they're very different. Even like the network buckets that you place them in, how they span and how they scale across regions and availability zones and all these things. There's so many differences, and they're tiny differences. But all those tiny little differences, they add up to just change, entirely change the architecture, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely, and you I've met a few folks out there that are very deep in more than one cloud, like very deep, like great expertise, but it's a lot, especially if you're looking beyond one tight, multiple services infrastructure and you bring in more things. It's
Mhm.
definitely a huge challenge.
So that's usually a hill I will die on. Is when I give advice to customers, when they always ask me, should I be multi-cloud, and they have a choice from day one, I usually will say no, go single cloud only. The benefits of going single cloud far outweigh the benefits of being multi-cloud, unless there's a really good reason, whether it's a compliance reason or because you're getting $500,000 in funds from Azure, and they want you to put something on Azure or whatever, or AWS. I've never regretted saying that to customers is, if you have a choice, I'd go single cloud. That piggybacks off my last statement though of saying, but if you get so far into the weeds and you end up backing yourself into a corner, you always have to reevaluate that decision in the future. And so it's never a one-time decision to move on. You always have to rethink that. But the investment you have in educating your staff, the partnership that you get with cloud, whether it's AWS or Azure or GCP, the support that they'll give you to be on that single cloud. Coming from the performance pillar expertise, the deeper you go into a technology, the more you know how something in cloud native works, the better performant it's going to be, the less costly it's going to be, the more secure it's going to be. If you try to baseline, like normalize your technology stack, like Kubernetes is a great example. So you can put it theoretically from AWS to Azure to on-prem, you're going to increase all of your costs. You're going to decrease all of your performance, and you're going to make it a little less secure because of that. So it dumbs down all of your benefits when you go multi-cloud.
Yeah. I remember there was some big hype around Kubernetes, and I think it was like DR. This was like years ago, even at some of the companies I worked for, like there was this thought that, a containerized workload can just be placed anywhere. So we want the best diversity possible. So we're going to have an app that lives in one cloud in one region. And then for that other region, it's going to be a different cloud in a region. And, really the right way to do that is to do, span across availability zones, of course, and then do regional DR with a single cloud provider. For like usually taking a single application and running that across multiple clouds doesn't make much sense. Well, I don't think it would ever make sense unless maybe someone, if you're out there and this makes sense and you've done something valuable with it, reach out. We would love to have you on. But yeah, that's yeah.
I've helped a few enterprise companies be multi-cloud for the sole purpose of disaster recovery, and typically the complexity that adds, because in the end you still have the single point of failure, which is typically your DNS management, your routing, network routing, and a lot of times during those game days where you test out your disaster recovery solution, you end up coming to the conclusion. You're like, how do we take care of this? Because, for example, on AWS, if their US East 1 region goes down, which is their control plane, it's where they manage all of their services. If that goes down, there's no way for me to manage Route 53, even if I need to point it to Azure, and then if I end up moving it to a third party DNS router, well, underlying are those that third party DNS. Is it on prem? Is it hosted by AWS or Azure behind the scenes? Um, it's so hard to be truly redundant across the board. And so sticking with one cloud provider, being multi-region, having air gaps in place for multiple accounts is your best bet. And because, as you said, if you're not building an application that uses that cloud native, there's so many disadvantages of making it making it standalone and not dependent on the cloud services. You're losing so much value out of that, and that you would only, um, really see the value of that. If your environment goes down again and again and again, you end up using that disaster recovery environment.
Well, the dependency mapping has always been a challenge, right? And especially dependency mapping over time, because you may have your dependency maps built out in the very beginning, but then services move around and you don't always completely redo your dependency map, right? I mean, we ran into this in the early days of virtualization, right? Where you would have a domain controller that was hardware based, but then at some point somebody's like, well, everything's virtualized now. Let's just virtualize these remaining domain controllers. And then all of a sudden you have a virtualization outage. Oh, by the way, now your domain controllers are down and you can't authenticate anything, right? Like this is a 15-year-old problem. That has not gotten better. That's actually gotten worse with the cloud, those dependency mappings. And you're absolutely right. If you lose identity, if you lose DNS, nothing else matters. I think so. The thing I've seen customers do that I think works really well is you select a primary cloud. That's where the vast majority of your workloads go. Undifferentiated services are going to run in that cloud. It's your primary. And then if you have a differentiated service that you need to run in another cloud, sure, you can do that. And that may make sense. But you're absolutely right on the contractual pieces, the discounting, the cloud relationship. And I've seen organizations who have tried to take a um unopinionated view of cloud, and it just doesn't work well. It's very expensive. You end up with services that run in a million different places that are managed by a million different people, and then how do you govern that, right? And so, while I might argue for a different public cloud to be your primary cloud, I still very much agree that you need a primary cloud to run your services in, and that's what's gonna make organizational sense for you. And to not make that decision, is really frankly a failure of leadership for your organization.
Yeah. Well, what I have found though is back to the original topic of kind of cloud governance, is some of those questions and guidance is still missing out there in the industry in general. Is saying pick a primary cloud for most of your control plane, for your identity, for your DNS, for your services that are kind of singletons like that. And then this is how to back into a multi-cloud strategy, or this is how to back into a disaster recovery in a single cloud environment. So there's still a lot of, I'd say, missing industry best practices that are from a central source and from an authority at some level. And so that's really where I think the future of cloud is going to go over the next few years. Looking at the Amazon services or even the Azure services that have been released in the last 3 years, so many more of them are now at the governance level at this, that it's just now, this industry is just now starting to bring up this more broader topic, just like this year. Up until now, it was trying to solve issues from the bottom up. And I think we're just now able to get from the top and start going down now.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think I'm fresh out of questions. What about you, Yvonne? Do you got anything else you want to hit on?
No, I think it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, I think we're hitting our time cap, which good timing. But if the audience wants to find you, Ryan, where can they find you at?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn if you search for my name, Ryan Comingdeer, or you can find me on the platformer.cloud website. And that's no E before the last R. So platformer.cloud.
I love that, by the way. That is just a really, it's so hard to find a name that is like different, that stands out, that's not overly complicated or just something random. and it is like true to kind of like what you're doing. But yeah, that's a really cool name. So kudos on the brain architect behind the name and the brand.
So bring this back to the beginning. I think I'm going to try to make that a Gen Z slang word, so people just start naturally saying it in the everyday language.
I dig it.